Did you know that a single decision made thousands of years ago by a man named Esau triggered a chain of events that ended the existence of an entire nation? A nation that built powerful cities, challenged Israel, and even tried to exterminate the promised Messiah, yet simply disappeared from history as if it had never existed. In today's video, we will uncover the shocking truth behind Esau's lineage, the dark fate of the hidden secrets in Mount Seir, the astonishing connections to Herod the Great, and how all of this is deeply tied to biblical prophecies fulfilled with a precision that will leave you speechless. From the very beginning in the pages of Genesis, the Bible introduces us to characters whose choices shaped not only their lives, but the entire course of redemptive history. Esau, the firstborn of Isaac and grandson of Abraham, emerges as one of these key figures. In Genesis 25, verse 30 to 34, we find a simple yet deeply significant episode. Esau, exhausted and famished after a day in the field, sells his birthright to Jacob for a bowl of lentil stew. At first glance, it seems like an impulsive moment, an insignificant exchange. But was it really just that? The Bible makes it clear Esau despised what God had given him. That birthright was not merely a material inheritance. It was the promise, the spiritual right to lead the chosen people to play an active role in the fulfillment of God's divine plan. And the name Edom, it's curious. It derived from the word red, the color of the stew for which Esau traded his blessing, but it also refers to his own appearance at birth. In Genesis 36:1, we read, "Now these are the generations of Esau, who is Edom." Not just genealogy. It's a mark, a label, carrying prophetic significance. Rejecting the blessing, Esau chose a path of deviation. His lineage, the Edomites, would become a people living in the shadows of God's plan, harboring resentment and pride against their brothers, the descendants of Jacob. Do you see how Esau's decision echoed beyond his own life? His choice paved the way for the rise of a people who from the womb of history already bore a deep tension against Israel. And this conflict, as we will see, wasn't limited to a single isolated episode. On the contrary, it unfolds throughout the pages of biblical history, crossing generations, geographies, and prophecies. Because while Esau was choosing a bowl of lentils, God in his sovereignty was already laying out a much greater plan, a plan that would not only reveal the nature of God's promise, but also the reality of judgment upon Edom. Think about this. What seemed like a simple meal opened the doors for the rise of an entire nation. Edom, whose descendants would spread across the lands of Mount Seir, carrying the weight of a choice that sooner or later would demand a price. But that we'll explore in the next part of our journey. When the Bible mentions Mount Seir, it is not merely pointing to just any mountain on the ancient map. It is presenting to us the home of the Edomites, the land of Esau's lineage, a territory that would become the stage for conflicts, pride, and eventually judgment. In Genesis 36:8, we read, "Thus dwelt Esau in Mount Seir. Esau is Edom." Isn't it? The verse not only identifies a geographical location, but also directly connects Esau to the destiny of his descendants. Mount Seir was a mountainous, rugged region full of red cliffs and impressive canyons. A harsh land almost like the very heart of the Edomites themselves. The region, which today corresponds to southern Jordan, was strategic, a kind of corridor between the great ancient civilizations. Trade routes passed through there, and the inhabitants of Mount Seir profited from this. But despite the apparent geographical advantage, this land also bore the weight of a history stained by hasty decisions like Esau's, and by Edom's constant enmity against Israel. There, among the red rocks of Seir, the Edomites built their fortresses, such as the famous Petra, a city carved into the rocks that seemed unshakable to human eyes, but which before the judgment of God was doomed to crumble. The very landscape of Mount Seir reflects this story, a dry, inhospitable desert where the mountains seem to rise like silent witnesses to Esau's choice. It's as if the land cries out, "Here Edom was born, here pride grew, Here, a people rose up against their brothers. But as we will see, the fact that Edom was geographically protected among mountains would not be enough to escape the consequences of their actions. Because sooner or later, the prophecy concerning Edom would begin to be fulfilled in a dramatic manner involving powerful peoples like the Babylonians and the Nabateans. But that part of the story is coming up next. When we look at the people of Edom, the lineage of Esau, it is impossible to ignore the dark tone that Scripture casts over their trajectory. In Obadiah 13, we read, "The pride of thine heart hath deceived thee." Here lies the core of the problem. Edom was known for its arrogance, for the sense of invincibility that Mount Seir seemed to offer. The cities carved into the mountains, like the impressive Petra, gave the Edomites the illusion that they were untouchable, protected by natural walls and the difficult access of the terrain. But you see, the Bible is clear. No matter how high a man's fortress stands, if he is in rebellion against God, that fortress is nothing but sinking sand before divine judgment. But the pride of the Edomites was not their only sin. There was also the constant enmity of Edom against Israel. In Numbers 20:14-21, we see that when Israel needed to pass through Edom's territory during the Exodus, the Edomites not only refused passage, but came armed to prevent the Israelites. As if bitterness passed down from generation to generation fueled an almost visceral rivalry. And it didn't stop there. On various occasions, Edom allied itself with Israel's enemies, celebrating their defeats, plundering their cities, participating in betrayals, and looting. The Old Testament portrays Edom as a people who not only rejected the way of God, but also actively acted against the chosen people. Not neutral in the story. It was a willing accomplice and declared enemy. The biblical narrative shows a pattern. Enmity, betrayal. They didn't just build a city of stones. They raised a heart of stone against God's purposes. But as we will see next, when a people harden their hearts like that, the judgment of God is only a matter of time. And the prophets had already announced exactly what was about to happen to Edom. The Bible does not just record Edom's history. It also reveals the prophesied future of the Edomites. And with remarkable clarity in Obadiah 1:10, the Lord declares, "For thy violence against thy brother Jacob, shame shall cover thee, and thou shalt be cut off forever." Strong words, aren't they? This announcement does not come from an angry man, but from God himself, who sees Edom's pride and enmity as something unforgivable. It wasn't just a political rivalry. It was a spiritual confrontation, an affront to the divine plan. And it doesn't stop there. In Ezekiel 35:15, there is another prophetic blow. "So will I do unto thee. Thou shalt be desolate, O Mount Seir, and all Idumea." Do you feel the weight of that? Mount Seir itself, Edom's natural fortress, would be devastated. What seemed secure and impenetrable would crumble into ruins. The prophecies about Edom are like a coming sentence, and with every word from the prophets, we hear the echo of an inevitable judgment. It's interesting to note that the word desolation appears repeatedly in these prophecies. God is essentially saying, "You built cities in the rocks, but I will tear down every stone. You laughed at Israel's downfall, but shame will fall upon you." It's as if every act of pride and every moment of enmity against Israel had accumulated before the Lord until the moment when the cup was full and God's judgment was pronounced. These prophetic words were not just vague predictions. They were the promise that Edom's evil would not go unpunished. The fulfillment of the prophecies would come through historical invasions and conquests. Something that begins to unfold precisely with the Babylonians and the Nabateans. As we will see next, the prophecies that condemned Edom were not just left on paper, nor were they merely empty words. They were fulfilled, and in a remarkable way. Quickly, the territory of Edom became the target of powerful empires. And this was no coincidence. Around the 6th century BC, the Babylonians, that same empire that destroyed Jerusalem, invaded Edom, fulfilling God's judgment. The natural fortress of Mount Seir was not enough to protect them. The people who thought they were untouchable were crushed. But the Babylonians were not the only ones. After the Babylonian destruction, Edom was left vulnerable, and another people emerged to occupy their lands, the Nabateans. These skilled traders established themselves mainly in Petra, turning it into a famous trading center. What was once the home of the Edomites was now in the hands of foreigners. The irony is clear. Edom, who once boasted of their cities in the rocks, now saw their fortresses belonging to other peoples. The Edomite pride that had rejected God's blessing and nurtured enmity against Israel could not stand against the forces God raised to fulfill His words. The invasions of the Babylonians and Nabateans were not merely geopolitical events. They were the literal fulfillment of prophecy. Every stone torn down, every city lost, every family taken captive was a confirmation that God's judgment is sure. Now, think about this. As Edom vanished before the world's eyes, a silent transformation was taking place. Esau's descendants did not disappear from history immediately. They mingled, adapted, and a new name would arise in place of Edom. Who were they now? They would become known as the Idumeans. And this new phase of the story leads us directly to a figure many know, Herod the Great. After the Babylonian invasions and the domination by the Nabateans, the people of Edom, the descendants of Esau's lineage, did not disappear immediately, at least not yet. They were forced to migrate to abandon Mount Seir and eventually spread throughout the southern region of Judah, a territory known as Idumea. From that moment on, the Edomites came to be known as Idumeans. Doesn't like a mere geographical detail? This is crucial because this change of name and territory also represents a change of identity, a cultural blending that would bring new dark chapters to biblical history. The Idumeans were in essence the same Edomites, just under a different name. But there was a bitter irony in this transition. The people who once rejected God's blessing and had persecuted Israel were now under Jewish rule, living in the shadow of the temple in Jerusalem. At one point during the Maccabean period, the Idumeans were forced to convert to Judaism. But this conversion was superficial, political, a means of survival, and not a true change of heart. Pride of Edom was still there, hidden beneath the facade of a new name. This new status of the Idumeans would become a crucial stage for future events. The lineage of Esau, now diluted in the name of Idumea, still carried the weight of ancient rivalries and God's judgment. And it is precisely from this lineage that Herod the Great arises, an Idumean by blood, who would rule under Roman authority and ironically would attempt to exterminate the promised Messiah, the descendant of Jacob, Jesus Christ. It's fascinating how Edom's story does not end merely in archaeological ruins or the pages of prophecies. It continues woven into the history of Israel and the divine purposes, showing that the fulfillment of God's promises is meticulous and perfect. But the appearance of Herod is only the beginning of an even more astonishing climax. Because the prophecy about the end of Edom was about to be completely fulfilled. It is impossible to speak of the Edomites without mentioning one of the most well-known names of the New Testament, Herod the Great. Herod was an Idumean, a direct descendant of Esau's lineage. This is not just a historical detail. It is a key piece in the mosaic of prophecy fulfillment. Herod, a foreigner disguised as a Jew, ruled over the Jews, but his lineage came from the one who had sold his birthright for a bowl of lentils. It's as if the story of Edom had played its final card, trying once again to thwart God's plan. Remember, Herod the Great was the king who ordered the massacre of the boys in Bethlehem in Matthew 2:16, in a desperate attempt to eliminate the newborn Messiah, the descendant of Jacob, the rightful promised king. Fascinating, isn't it? The confrontation between the lineages of Esau and Jacob, begun centuries earlier, reaches here a dramatic climax. Herod the Edomite tries to extinguish the light of Christ but fails because God's plan cannot be thwarted by men, not even by kings. Herod represents, in many ways, the enmity of Edom against Israel, manifested in the flesh. But he is also the living proof that God's judgment is inevitable. His death, the ruin of his dynasty, and the collapse of his kingdom demonstrate that no human power, no matter how great it may seem, can stand against what God has decreed. And when we look at history, we realize that after Herod, the presence of the Idumeans disappears. The end of the Edomites is drawing ever closer, but the final judgment still needed to be sealed. This leads us to understand what really happened to Edom as a nation and how the prophecies about Edom reached their conclusion. The inevitable question arises: what happened to Edom? Where are the Edomites today? The answer is straightforward and striking. Edom is gone. An entire people with cities like Petra, fortresses on Mount Seir, wealth and pride simply vanished from the pages of history as if it had been wiped off the map. But this was not the work of chance or a mere geopolitical collapse. It was the fulfillment of prophecy, the execution of God's judgment. In Malachi 1:4, we read, "Whereas Edom saith, we are impoverished, but we will return and build the desolate places. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, they shall build, but I will throw down, and they shall call them the border of wickedness, and the people against whom the Lord hath indignation forever." That forever is chilling. Edom tried to rebuild, tried to rise again, but God himself declared it would not happen. After the fall of Herod, the Idumeans, the last visible representatives of Esau's lineage, disappeared. There are no historical records of a restoration of Edom as a nation. Their lands were absorbed by other peoples, their cities destroyed or turned into archaeological ruins, and the name Edom became a memory, an echo of judgment. Notice the divine irony. The people who dwelt in the heights, in the stone fortresses, who mocked Israel and trusted in their own pride, were reduced to dust. Edom's pride became its downfall. And as we look at history, we see clearly that God keeps his promises both of blessing and of judgment. But there's something even more astonishing. How this story of pride, judgment, and disappearance completes the picture of the prophecies about Edom in a literal way, closing a trajectory that began with a simple exchange of a birthright for a bowl of lentils. There's still one last piece to fit into this puzzle. The definitive confirmation that all of this was not just a historical coincidence, but the faithful fulfillment of Scripture. And that's what we will see in the next point. When we look at the history of Edom in light of the Bible, there is no denying what God said, God fulfilled. The prophecies about Edom spread across books like Obadiah, Ezekiel 35, and Malachi 1 were not left in the realm of possibilities. They were fulfilled literally, point by point. The divine promise was clear. Edom's pride would be brought low, its land desolated, and its people exterminated. Edom's enmity against Israel, the contempt for sacred things, the persecution of the descendants of Jacob. All of this accumulated a sentence that sooner or later would be executed. The Old Testament repeatedly warns us about God's judgment. But in Edom, this judgment was not just announced. It was seen, experienced, and recorded. The Babylonian invasion, the Nabatean domination, the end of Esau's lineage as a distinct people, the rise and fall of Herod the Great. Each event is like a piece that fits perfectly into the prophetic puzzle. The very disappearance of Edom as a nation, leaving no heirs or continuity, is a powerful testimony that the words of God are irrevocable. It's as if history is shouting to us. When God speaks, he fulfills. The end of the Edomites was not a historical coincidence, but the direct result of their choices and God's judgment. Every detail of the prophecy manifested: their cities desolated, their lands taken by other peoples, the name Edom reduced to dust, and the echo of a lineage that once tried to defy God's plan, but could not withstand the weight of God's hand. And if all this happened to Edom, what can we learn about God's character, his justice, and his faithfulness? That's a question for us to reflect on together as we continue exploring the profound teachings of Scripture. If you want to keep diving into the mysteries of the Bible, understanding how every detail, every story, and every prophecy connects perfectly,